966.
We are pleased to be speaking now with Jeffrey Beyer, Managing Director, Zest Associates, a Dubai-based consultancy that develops sustainability solutions for governments and private companies for the low-carbon economy. So much to get to on the topic of sustainability and climate ESG with COP27 and COP28 taking place in the Middle East region. Jeffrey, thank you so much for joining us on the 966.
It's a real pleasure to be here, guys.
Hi, Jeffrey. Yes, echoing Lucian. Thanks so much for joining us. And as we've communicated, we're kind of excited about this because I feel like I'm going to class because I don't know much about sustainability, and I know you're deep into this and have really thought it through. Can you tell us before we launch into the initial question a little bit about Zest?
Yeah, for sure. So I moved to Dubai a couple of years ago to start Zest Associates. It is a sustainability consultancy looking across like climate policy, clean tech innovation, and green finance. So we even bottom out some of those terms in our chat. But I work with like governments and companies to help them develop strategies around how to improve sustainability, advance low carbon innovations, and then get those things funded. So that's what I do. I work with partners. I've got a team around the world, and it's a really exciting time to be doing this type of work.
How is business? Is there increasing interest, or is already a great deal of interest?
You know what? There's a huge amount of increasing interest. ESG, especially, we'll go into what that means as well. But that's definitely something hot, like a hot topic. But as COP28 approaches in the UAE, especially, there's a huge amount of anticipation for that. People really want to understand how they can prepare, what kind of announcements they can make. And as a country and as a region, I think there's this increasing recognition that the future is sustainable, and there's a real need to diversify and transition into something that looks a bit different than today's world. So yeah.
Yes, you referenced a coming question, the difference between sustainability and ESG. So, but let's kick this off. So sustainability, what are we really talking about? We have a UN definition, and the UN definition is, quote, meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs, unquote. And we know that it's a front and center topic for many countries in the region, including Saudi Arabia. There's a UNESCO meeting in Paris right now, and the opening statement by a very high level Saudi delegation was all about sustainability. So, Jeffrey, please, what is sustainability?
Yeah, it's a good question. And Richard, the quote, that's like the 1987 Brundtland report, like quote, what is sustainable development, right? And it's a really broad definition, and it covers a lot of different dimensions of what sustainability is. So, sustainable development is kind of the broadest sense of sustainability. I'm going to start from the other side just to try and describe this really, really clearly, and be the most narrow I can. So like low carbon, I think, is one thing that people talk about. It's really related to climate change, and it deals specifically with reducing greenhouse gas emissions that cause climate change. So climate change mitigation and low carbon are the same thing. If you expand that climate change question or domain to include adaptation, the kind of reverse of mitigation, right? Adaptation is about adapting to the inevitable impacts of climate change. So we know that sea level is going to rise, it's going to get hotter, storms are more severe and frequent, fires happen more often. So managing that hotter world, that inevitably hotter world, which is coming, that's all about adaptation. So if you take mitigation and adaptation together, those two things are the climate conversation, okay? Then you expand one extra dimension, and you can include other environmental issues. So forests, biodiversity, soil health, water, all of these things kind of fall into the environment domain. So you've got like low carbon, which is mitigation. You've got climate, which is mitigation and adaptation. Then you have environment, which is all the climate stuff plus like every other kind of environmental thing you can think of, soil, water, biodiversity. That's all under like the environmental banner. If you want to expand it out a little bit further, you can look at like social and environment. It's like social and economic and governance type questions, right? Mm-hmm. So that's where we get into like environment, social, and governance, ESG, and that taken together comprises like sustainability and sustainable development. So we've heard about like this triple bottom line, right? Looking at people, planet, and profit. People is like the social part, planet, the environment part, profits, the economic part. So, it's a bunch of little nested terms kind of, but you can move from the really specific, which is like climate change mitigation, which is my personal focus, all the way up to a full scale like ESG, sustainable development, hitting that definition that you talked about at the beginning, Richard.
So when you look at that the UN agenda, there's 17 sustainability goals, and if you get into them, you're exactly right. There's not only climate mitigation, but also poverty, hunger, public health. So it is extraordinarily broad, and it's interesting how you broke that down: environment, social, and economic. And I've never heard the people, planet, profits. I like that. Alliteration is always good for slow thinkers like myself. so, so you say so let's, while we're on the subject, and since you brought it up, so I blame this entirely on you, Jeffrey. The difference between sustainability and ESG. Now, can a little bit of research. I mean, is it worth me sort of throwing out my understanding, what I've read, or let's just jump into your distinction?
Well, yeah, I mean, feel free to air your thoughts. No, but I'll just jump into it. So listen, ESG is like, it's something that's quite specific to reporting, and like governments or companies being able to prepare reports and share and disclose information to shareholders and people who are investing in them. So ESG is really like a set of rules and criteria that you can measure and improve over time to make your company more sustainable. It looks at like E, which is environment, S, social, and G, governance things, right? So try and reduce emissions, or reduce the amount of water you use in the E component. For the social part, you can look at gender diversity in your workforce, or who's there from what different countries, like how many different nationalities you employ, all kinds of different things in the S part. In the G part, the governance part, you can say like, how do we have a policy for anti-bribery and corruption? How are we making sure that our company is governed in a way that's really watertight? And those things together, if you're managing to get like a really good like balance of your ESG criteria, then it means that you've got a relatively sustainable company, and it should be one that can last for a while. There's a lot of like risk around ESG, in my opinion. So I think that people have used ESG a lot to compare things that, in my opinion, don't really compare, right? I think it's difficult to say like diversity on your board is or can be compared to the emissions that your company produces, and that can be compared to like other governance components. So like if you have a really good score in your E and you're really falling down in your S, like, are you a sustainable company? I don't know. I think that ESG, there may be a role or a need to kind of break apart some of those letters and focus really on climate change and environment as being something quite distinct from the S and the G part.
Is it fair to say that the ESG is largely an analysis of a company's efforts to meet these standards? So a corporation, and that sustainability, is just one of these pillars for a corporation. So, and to make your distinction, which is that you may be hitting the mark on sustainability, but not on governance or social, whatever. Whereas sustainability, your expertise is strictly, and as you say, you're focused especially on the climate side. So ESG becomes sort of an investment framework that helps external investors assess if a company is meeting its goals or has had goals at all.
That's right. And it also helps the companies assess their own risk to different risks. So often it's not about like how badly the company is affecting the environment in terms of the E, but it's more the reverse, like how much of a risk is environmental change to the company. Do you know what I mean? So it almost flips the question on its head. And for some reasons, like that doesn't always mean you're going to get the best outcome. You need to protect your assets from flooding. That's an E thing, but like you're not really thinking about how your assets are going to cause flooding by polluting, for example. So ESG can be thought of in this almost reverse way. It's about like protecting companies and explaining risk. That's what it can be thought of.
And so I referenced the UNESCO delegation, the Saudi delegation to UNESCO in Paris ongoing. I guess those meetings end tomorrow, the 19th. Tell us a little bit about Saudi Arabia, because it's certainly part of the vocabulary now. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
I mean, PIF just the Public Investment Fund just issued a $3 billion sort of ESG fund. So yes, it's part of their dialogue and their investment and their vocabulary.
Yeah, it's very exciting. I mean, I think the more people that get involved in sustainability, the better, the better it is. And PIF obviously is a huge, like, heavyweight in this space. Um, I think that there's a lot of changes that have happened that are making this a lot more accessible to everybody, but also to people in Saudi Arabia. So first of all, you know, from a climate perspective, we're really starting to see the impacts of climate change manifest, right? Over the summertime, we saw these floods in Pakistan, we've seen fires in Australia, we've seen all kinds of issues happening. That's really bringing the fact that climate change is real and happening today, not in the distant future. It's really bringing that to the fore. I think we also have this sense that, like, the global conversation's matured a lot, right? There's a lot of political support for climate action through the Paris Accord, the big UN Accord. People are aware that this is going on and they want the governments to take some action. Businesses see the commercial opportunity in low carbon transition and in different investments. I know PIF has invested a lot in hydrogen trucks, for example, and electric vehicles. They're doing a lot of low carbon investments, and that's because they see that commercial opportunity. I think for Saudi Arabia as well, there's this awareness that the oil party isn't going to last forever, and I think that there's this almost existential recognition that you need to use this big chunk of cash that we're getting now from high oil prices to be able to invest in a transition and economic pathway that's going to be long-term sustainable. And I think these are very elastic markets. Prices can go up and down. And I think that recognizing that there is this whole future economy out there, which is sustainable, is one that we really need to wrap our hands around in order to create this longevity in terms of a prosperous society in Saudi.
Jeffrey, you referenced Saudi Arabia's greater commitment to sustainability, and it's certainly part of the vocabulary. The issue is really apropos because next month COP27 starts up Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt, and there seems to be a significant amount of energy, or I don't know what's the word, realism, acceptance that these climate challenges are genuine and real, and that we're lagging as a globe. So it'll be interesting for me anyway to see what comes out of those Glasgow meetings for the COP26 in terms of a commitment to say, all right, let's stop talking about amorphous commitments, talk about real commitments, real numbers. What are you going to do? But anyway, where does Saudi Arabia sort of fit in this bigger picture?
Yeah, it's a good question. So Saudi Arabia upped their emission reduction target substantially, actually. So they're looking to reduce, I don't know, by almost like 300 megatons a year by 2030 emissions. They haven't set a baseline though, so it's a little bit challenging to understand exactly where they're measuring from. But nevertheless, a strengthened target is a good thing. And Saudi's also really taking the lead, with the Saudi Green Initiative and with the Middle East Green Initiative across a number of different fronts. So some of them look at planting like 10 billion trees in Saudi Arabia. Obviously, a hugely ambitious program, especially for such a dry country, but one that is actually, I think, achievable with the right type of mix. And I think what is interesting in Saudi Arabia as well is the technology investment and innovation in other low carbon technologies. So we can talk about hydrogen as being an especially important low carbon technology for the future, and one that I think is going to really transform energy markets, energy trade, and give a massive shot in the arm to Saudi Arabia and other big potential producers to manufacture and export green hydrogen and potentially blue hydrogen as well. So I think that the country is really taking the lead on some of these really big industrial opportunities for climate change.
So one of the things that stumps me, and maybe it's a failure of imagination, is when I hear about these sustainability goals, and they are extensive, and you just talk about any sector in Saudi Arabia, they're moving heavily into EVs, electric vehicles, and they have Lucid Motors, they have Hyzon Motors, who's working with Aramco. But even talking about in the minerals and mining sector, they're showing a real commitment to doing this in a sustainable manner, which I can only assume, and to go on down the line, same thing in production of steel, same thing in the construction of buildings, waste and water. They're talking about trying to have desalination plants that are based entirely on renewable energy. So it's across the board. Who pays for this? How does it get financed?
I mean, these are good projects, right? And I think the thing that historically people have thought about when they're thinking about financing a green project is that it was going to be something that you do because you care, because you care about something other than the bottom
out of the
line.
goodness of your heart.
But the truth is that this has been one of the challenges for a lot of sustainable solutions in the past, is that they delivered on these environmental aspects, but didn't have the kind of cost competitiveness that other technologies did. And I think that innovation is amazing, and we've managed to be able to reduce the cost of these things so that they're not only better performing in terms of their environmental credentials, but actually have a as good or better return on investment compared to the old way of doing things. So that's, I think, the first thing to mention is that these projects are really good. They're good, solid investment decisions, and they wouldn't be taken if they weren't. In terms of financing more generally, I actually recently did a report on financing a green transition in the Middle East. It was done with the Mohammed bin Rashid School of Government and sponsored by HSBC. And we looked at 8 countries in the Middle East, so the GCC countries plus Egypt and Iraq, and looked at different financial mechanisms that we could use to accelerate green finance. There were six enablers, so kind of things that created the macro conditions to allow finance to flow, and 8 different specific financial tools, so things that could actually raise capital and deploy it into certain areas. For Saudi Arabia, a couple of the things that really stuck out were, one of them was an enabler, so creating a really solid financing strategy. So that's looking at what the targets and the goals and ambitions of the country were, translating those targets and ambitions into a project pipeline, and then figuring out what kind of financing best matched each project to be able to finance it in the most cost-effective way possible. There's all kinds of different pots of money out there, different ways of financing projects through loans, guarantees, project finance, all different ways of financing things. And by really lining up that project list and matching it with the right type of finance, you can get a really kind of efficient flow of finance to turn those ambitions into a reality of a project pipeline that gets genuinely built. So that's one way to do it, is create this financing strategy. I think a couple other things that could be done are, first of all, use sovereign wealth funds. And I know you mentioned PIF earlier; they're already quite engaged in this space. I think sovereign wealth funds always have even further to go, and there could be kind of rules around screening. So you can screen any investment that you're going to make against a number of environmental credentials, and if that screening shows that the project is going to have a positive impact on the environment, then you go for it. If it's going to have a negative impact on the environment, then maybe it gets marked down a peg or two in terms of your overall scoring metric when you decide what to invest in. So I think there's ways to structure the investment framework for sovereign wealth funds that can be really effective. I think one other thing just to mention that isn't always super popular anywhere is carbon pricing. So a cap and trade system or a carbon tax. The point of these things, people are often like, oh, but you don't want to charge someone for carbon that will slow down the economy or whatever. But it can be really designed in a way that returns the capital that's raised from carbon taxes, for example, or cap and trade, and reinvest it into the economy to be able to get more innovation and more kind of low carbon solutions coming out of the country. So you can use a tax on pollution essentially to reinvest in economically productive things. Pollution is often a waste product. So if you can reduce that waste and instead invest the money you raise from taxing it into innovation, then you're in a much better position at the end. So those are a couple of the things that we looked at around how to kind of level the playing field and select the right projects to invest in.
On that last point, I know Saudi Arabia's established the Middle East Carbon Exchange, and the rampant criticism about carbon credits and carbon tax and that sort of thing is that it doesn't reflect the real cost, and it's largely abused by people who use it. And then maybe that's too much of a blanket statement, but a significant percentage of people are, are buying or acquiring carbon credits that don't really lead to overall mitigation or net positive mitigation. Is something like that likely to be part of the conversation at Sharm el Sheikh for the COP27 next month?
Yeah, I mean, carbon credits are a dicey one. So I've worked in this space for a while, right? And there are different standards around like how robust a carbon credit is. Planting a forest, you get a carbon credit. Reducing factory emissions from in Namibia, you'll get a carbon credit. So but building a windmill instead of a gas plant in Ghana will also get you a carbon credit. It's sometimes very, very challenging to really identify what's a genuine reduction, what's a reduction against like what would have happened in the absence of that action, and then what's a reduction that's permanent, right? If you plant a forest and then the forest gets cut down or burns down, then that carbon credit like doesn't exist anymore. So there's an issue around permanence, around accountability. They're a tough nut to crack. I think that they have a place for sure. There's a lot of really good projects that are funded through carbon credits. Whether I rely on them to solve climate change, definitely not. They don't always genuinely reduce the current flow of emissions into the atmosphere, which is what we ultimately need to do. Will it be a topic in Sharm el Sheikh? Yeah, I don't know. I don't really think it's going to be a huge topic. These are often regional things that are discussed. So, in the EU, for example, there's an emissions trading scheme that's been going on for 15 years or more. In the US, they've got a carbon trading scheme as well, right? California has hooked up with New York, and you have the Western Climate Initiative, plus a couple of Canadian provinces. In China, there's a carbon trading system. So these are more regionally based. I think what the opportunity is for Saudi Arabia and for the Middle East is creating a regional carbon trading network that can then link in to these other existing frameworks. So because the economic structure in the Middle East is not vastly different between each country, you're not going to get these real benefits, like really cheap emission reductions in Saudi Arabia versus Kuwait, for example. They're kind of reducing emissions from the same types of sources, which means they're going to be roughly the same price to reduce. The benefit of linking systems is that you can target those cheap and easy reductions in Poland, for example, and trade the expensive reductions in Saudi Arabia and kind of get a financial benefit from that trade. So you're still reducing emissions, but doing it in a cost-effective way. That's the whole point of carbon trading.
Can we be sure that study you mentioned with HSBC, if you can send us is it available publicly?
Yeah, I'll send it to you. No problem.
Yeah. So
we'll include it in the.
We'll exactly. Sorry, Lucian.
No, I interrupted you. My bad.
Yeah. So let's talk about COP27. It's coming up, and as we mentioned, in Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt, starting November 6th through the 19th.
Yeah.
So we're talking close to 200 countries are invested in this, and obviously any number of tertiary and interested parties will be there. So it'll be. I hope Sharm el Sheikh can accommodate all the people to be there. So they put them all in a room, and they don't put them all in a room, but certainly. This is a consequential gathering. What do you expect might be some of the main outcomes?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I mean, I went to my first COP. It was COP13. So I don't know how long ago that was. 14 years ago, I guess.
Yeah.
Ali. They've gotten bigger and more, bigger and bigger every year, and also just more and more important. And we weren't saying COP and a number before, it wouldn't really have made sense to the layman person. But today, I think after Glasgow last year and the real public awareness of COP27 this year is going to be a big deal. So just to recap a little bit what happened last year. So at COP26, we got the Glasgow Climate Pact and the Paris Rulebook. So basically, at the Paris Accord, everyone agreed to set targets, and this is going to be the right thing to do. In Glasgow last year, we set the rule book, so everyone kind of is working from the same, singing from the same hymn sheet in some ways.
Can I interrupt 1 second, Jeffrey?
Yeah.
Sorry. So correct me if I'm wrong. The Paris Accord was 2015, right? And I think at that time there was still, a non-zero number of climate deniers, and some of them quite consequential. I think by the time we got to Glasgow last year, COP26, there was no more of that. There's really a discussion of what needs to be done. And is this correct?
That's right. It was really, so the outcome from Glasgow was around three things. It was like looking at a really transparent framework for reporting emissions, so everyone has to report in the same way. They developed common timeframes for emission reduction targets. So before, we were kind of starting from different baselines and looking at different targets. They kind of harmonized things across the world. And they actually talked about mechanisms and standards for international carbon markets at Glasgow as well. So basically, like, all the negotiations around how to operate an international climate system were agreed in Glasgow. This year, we've finished with the rules. We understand the rules now. Now it's all about implementation. And the COP in Egypt is been called like the Africa COP or the implementation COP, because we kind of understand what the rules are, and now we've set targets, and now it's time to actually implement and hit those targets. So I think some of the big outcomes that people are going to be looking for are around finance, really. So how do you actually invest in these projects and invest in these targets is number one. I think the second thing that's a really big deal, but a very thorny issue, is something around, it's called loss and damage. And loss and damage deals with kind of like the impacts of climate change that happen to countries that didn't cause the problem, right? So, if there's a big flood in Ghana, and it's because of climate change, like Ghanaians represent a tiny, tiny fraction of historic emissions. It's really the rich world in a way that is responsible for most of climate change emissions. And this idea that poor countries want to ask rich countries to pay for all the losses and damages that they're enduring from the rich countries' behavior in the past, that's been this thorny issue, and one that Egypt is meant to champion as representing the Africa group at the UN. So they really want to try and get wealthier countries to open the checkbook and pay for loss and damage. The challenge is that rich countries are worried about it because they don't want to have to sign a blank check for damages that may or may not necessarily have been their particular fault. So it's a very, very thorny issue, and one that's challenging in Egypt.
Yeah, thorny is a polite description, I think, because they didn't reach agreement in Glasgow. Perhaps is there any reason to believe they will reach agreement here? I mean, obviously the rich nations, their expectation what to pay was significantly less than poorer nations. And any reason to think that might change?
There's always hope. There's always hope for it. I think that we're going in a pretty fractious, like, international climate anyway, is, pardon the pun, the international situation. So it's going to be a tough COP anyway, in particular because there's so many energy security concerns globally, and that has a direct relation to emissions. So no, it's going to be a tough one. I think the difference is, though, that the COP in Egypt was never really meant to be this milestone COP. Milestone COPs happen every 2 or 3 years. Glasgow was a milestone COP, Paris was a milestone COP, and so will COP28 in the UAE next year. And the reason is because there's these kind of rhythm that's been set at the UN level. There was a rhythm that, like, Paris was supposed to succeed, and that was supposed to be a milestone COP where everyone set their targets. Glasgow was supposed to be a COP where everyone agreed to the rule book. And next year in the UAE, that COP is supposed to be the first global stock take, it's called. So when everyone comes and explains where they're at in terms of hitting their targets that they set a couple of years ago in Glasgow. So every like 2 or 3 years, it's kind of a 5-year cycle. You've got these milestones, and Egypt isn't a milestone COP. It's kind of an intermediary COP.
That's really interesting insight because so coming out of Glasgow, all the countries agreed they had to submit new plans, updated plans. And I guess thus far only 20 countries have submitted ones. Saudi Arabia not included in that 20. So I gather it's like, so what you're saying is COP27 was optional, COP28 is mandatory in terms of hitting these marks and actually submitting, plans that you're going to follow and you are committed to.
Yeah, that's right. It wasn't supposed to be optional, but I think we got pretty distracted this year. There was a lot going on this year.
Well, that's interesting. So tell us about, Saudi Arabia hasn't submitted updated plans. What plans do they have on the books now? And I think that was one of the significant things about Glasgow, as opposed to Paris, or preceding ones, where there was Saudi Arabia is part of a contingent that was digging in and saying, we don't think just a simple reduction of fossil fuels addresses a larger issue. And I think, they came to, Glasgow as part of a group, but a particularly notable part of the group, saying, we need to look at other options, circular carbon economies and other mitigation initiatives that are meaningful in the larger picture. And they were largely successful in broadening essentially the scope of what's considered mitigation on the part of the COP enterprise. But what are their commitments to date in terms of mitigation?
Yeah, so there is a net zero target for 2060. So most countries set it, if they're going to set a net zero target, have been 2050 as the target date. So Saudi Arabia is 10 years later.
I think China is too, right?
That's right. Yeah, and yeah, that's right. So not every country is on the 2050 track.
Yeah.
Saudi's one of them. It's fine. I don't believe there's any intermediary targets. So I don't think, like, typically, I know the UK, for example, has a 2030, a 2035 target, and so on. There's like these intermediate goals.
So it'll just be a big reveal in 2050 and 2060 to see if the planet's saved.
There's different strategies, right? I think some countries kind of plan, if they're going to hit their target and they really want to. Some want to just kind of keep increasing emissions until the very day that they have committed not to, and then just shut everything down. And I know in parts of Australia, for example, that's being discussed, and especially like coal exporting areas, they kind of want to just ramp up production, keep investing capital, and then the day you have to stop, you just turn off the lights and go home. But get as much revenue as you can in the meantime. Obviously, that's the wrong thing to do from a climate perspective, but I think from an economic perspective, you could argue, if you think you're isolated, then that could be a good idea. Honestly, I think that what you mentioned about the circular carbon economy is a really interesting way to approach this issue from Saudi Arabia's perspective, and it really brings, just to give a bit of sense of what this is, right? You're looking at carbon as being a cycle, which it is naturally, and there are kind of different components. You can reduce carbon by reducing emissions normally. You can remove carbon from the atmosphere by like planting forests or using technology to suck carbon out of the atmosphere. You can recycle it, and you can, reduce, remove, recycle,
and reuse.
Exactly. And you can reuse. So you can kind of turn carbon back into fuel, for example, by combining CO2 with hydrogen, and you can make like a synthetic fuel, like a jet fuel, right? So you can reuse carbon in this big cycle. So these four things around the circular carbon economy is something that Saudi Arabia has created through its G20 presidency. And I know CAPSARC is very engaged in creating a circular carbon economy tracker. And it's a really interesting perspective, actually, and one that I think people thought originally was a bit of a greenwash thing. But when you dig into the details, there's some real, like, legitimate, high quality thought there. And I think it's something that brings countries like Saudi Arabia into a conversation when so much of the economy is based on fossil fuels, and you need to try and square the circle around resources you have and the future you want. And those two things don't have to be mutually exclusive when it comes to climate.
So,
Jeffrey, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, go fire away.
Oh, yeah, if you don't mind. So I was going to ask you, Jeffrey, about hydrogen. It's a space that Richard and I have talked about a lot on this podcast. Kingdom seeks to become a global supplier of it. It already is a large consumer of hydrogen, but it's gray hydrogen now. It's because it's cheap. But blue and green hydrogen costs are coming down, big investments going in. Can you talk to us about the status of hydrogen in Saudi and some of the challenges and opportunities there?
Yeah, for sure. This is a great topic. And I actually just released a report a couple of weeks ago, again with HSBC and with the World Green Economy Organization, looking at priorities to accelerate the hydrogen industry. It was focused on the UAE and the UK, but the lessons are applicable in Saudi Arabia as well. First of all, I think it's a really, really exciting space. Definitely one that's going to create new industrial opportunities for countries like Saudi, which have great solar and wind resources, the right type of geology for carbon capture and storage to enable blue hydrogen, and lots of gas. So you've got all the kind of inputs that you need. Trading relationships, relative proximity to demand centers. There's lots of really good news stories for Saudi Arabia in this space. Plus, the Aqua Power, for example, investing in huge amounts of facilities, NEOM, Red Sea Development Company, PIF, they're all behind it. So you've got the right kind of government architecture behind hydrogen as well. So I think Saudi Arabia is in a very good position. I think that there's a lot of misconceptions around the ultimate prevalence and use and tradability of hydrogen as well. So, for me, hydrogen it takes a lot of energy to make hydrogen, right? It takes a lot of electricity, which takes a lot of space to make all the electricity. So hydrogen is a very precious resource. And I think when you look at where it ought to be used, it should really be focused on these sectors and these industries that are really, really hard to decarbonize. For example, chemicals, steel, aviation,
shipping.
Exactly. Where, in my opinion, it shouldn't be used is in heating, inland waterways. I think hydrogen cars don't make sense when you have electric vehicles that do the trick. But for trains that are long distance and heavy trucks, yeah, I think there's a role for hydrogen there. I think some people really think that it's like an everything solution, and for me, it's almost like the industries of last resort, the ones that you really can't decarbonize with electricity or some other ways, then you use hydrogen for it. There's so much to talk about in this space. I don't know if you want to talk about anything specific, like trade routes or who's going to do it. What do you think?
Well, definitely share with us the report you did. That'll be 2 reports that we share, but we definitely want to share that with our audience as well. Sounds fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, trading it is interesting as well because, hydrogen is hard to transport around. And I think that probably what's going to end up happening is if Saudi Arabia wants to be a big exporter, we're going to need to develop a pipeline for hydrogen. So a big long pipe either to Europe. I think what's very likely, and which I haven't actually heard a lot in the conversation around this, is looking a bit east and looking towards India as a big importer for hydrogen. India doesn't really have that much land to build a lot of renewable energy to both satisfy its own energy demand plus make all this hydrogen to decarbonize industry, for example. So I see India as being a very close, physically close neighbor, geographically, which could really benefit from the huge hydrogen potential that is in the Middle East and in Saudi Arabia in particular.
And if you go farther east, the only Saudi demonstration project in terms of exporting blue hydrogen was to Japan.
Yeah.
Yes, I think there's a lot to be revealed yet with regard to blue hydrogen and green hydrogen. And you speak about the cost. They're talking about the NEOM Green Hydrogen Initiative, which has Air Products, which is a U.S. company, and Aqua as well. They're talking about 4 gigawatts of renewable energy required to power that thing, and yeah, it's a fascinating play. And I suppose I guess my understanding is a lot of time it's transported as ammonia,
Yeah.
which is more easily transported. But the economics of blue and green don't yet make sense. And I think their hope is that it eventually will by the time they're ready to really export in volume.
And I think a challenge with ammonia, because you're right, that is the kind of most straightforward way of exporting hydrogen is as this ammonia carrier. But you need to make ammonia first, right? Which means combining hydrogen with nitrogen into ammonia. And then when you get to your destination, you need to either make ammonia straight.
Unmake it.
Yeah, unmake it. Unmake it. It's a huge energy in post, right? So you're using a ton of energy to make ammonia, then you're shipping it, then you're using a bunch more energy to break it apart. And by the time you get there, you've lost 70 to 85% of the energy input just from like forming ammonia. So I don't know. I don't really see that as being a really. I'm no. People disagree, but I find it hard to understand how this can be done really.
Well, and I have to, I'll be interested in that study you mentioned earlier on efforts in the region. You mentioned the 6 GCC states in Iraq and Egypt.
Yeah.
And the economics of all of this, so much of this, sustainability. And I'll just be curious because it seems like a reach to me because so many of the things like Saudi Arabia, what they're doing with hydrogen, for example, or even blue or green, but even carbon capture. These are lost leaders. And Saudi Arabia is pushing through because they're able to do it. They have the financial means, they have the political will. They see it as significant, essential part of their diversification away from fossil fuels. This is kind of a unique case. It's one that Pakistan can't do, Iraq can't do.
Yeah.
Egypt already has natural gas, but I mean, so I again, these sustainability issues, I'll be really interested. I think in the big picture, Saudi Arabia sort of sees it. I think they see parallels with the solar and wind power, land wind power, sectors where the technology markets push technologies provide markets, and you have these enormous leaps over a decade in terms of efficiency and cost and levelized cost of energy and so on and so forth. And so Saudi Arabia in some ways is taking this on. Others are too. There's plenty of hydrogen projects all over the world, but everyone's, I think, is sort of banking on the technological advances, significant technological advances, either in the carbon capture for that, for the blue hydrogen, or the electrolyzers and other technologies for green hydrogen. It's kind of a race. It's kind of a race. It's kind of fascinating to watch.
Oh, big time. And you're right to mention solar and wind. I mean, solar prices have fallen in 10 years by like 92%, right? So wind 56%. Its batteries are on this like nosedive trajectory in terms of their cost as well. And I think that it's one of the things that's really consistently underappreciated. And I remember, I don't know if you know IRENA, right? The International Renewable Energy Agency, and the International Energy Agency, actually, they put out kind of forecasts for how much solar would be deployed and what the cost would be. And like every year, they were way off. The IEA, way off. They way under bet on how much solar would take off. And every year, the cost fell way faster than they thought, and way more was produced than they thought. And I think that we're going to be in a similar type of kind of race to the top for innovation and cost reductions for hydrogen as well. You look at the US, the Inflation Reduction Act is pouring billions into this, technology plus many others. Once you get the innovative capacity of Americans like up and running, like watch out, they're going to do an amazing job. And the fact that China's on board building the biggest electrolyzers in the world, the energy security situation has made Europe double its demand expectations by 2030. Everyone's really piling in. And the same thing happened when we were trying to get a vaccine. Like, people really globally put their mind and effort towards this type of innovation. And I think you'll see really incredible things come out of it really quickly.
Jeffrey, Richard, if I may, just one quick question at the end here, because I wanted to ask this earlier, and I don't think we need to spend too much time on it, but I've seen a lot recently the phrase climate reparations, with developing countries like Pakistan looking for money from rich countries to sort of compensate them for, suffering the the problems of climate change. It seems to me like this is a sticking point. Things like this are going to start coming up in these COP discussions. Can you talk a little bit about that? And like, is that realistic? Is that going to happen? Is it something that's going to hold up the conversation at COP? And what do you think about that?
Yeah, it is a very, very challenging. So reparations, this is the same thing as loss and damage, which I mentioned briefly earlier. You're right. You know what? It's a tough one to really crack, and I don't know how it's going to go forward. I think it could be a real sticking point actually, because these UN conferences rely on consensus. Everyone has to agree, and for so long, developing countries have been asking for transfers of money. Right, there was a promise to do $100 billion a year. I think last year there was like $83 billion a year, but governments can relabel money that's already been spent. And, it's very, very challenging to know whether or not these transfers of wealth are happening. Developing countries want grants, developed countries want to give loans that are repaid. So there's all of these challenges around the money. And especially coming out of COVID, and then we're looking at energy price supports, like we've just mobilized like trillions of dollars globally in these two circumstances. So I think that the idea that 100 billion here and there like is an impossible sum has kind of lost its reality, because you look and countries have mobilized 10 times that much to manage COVID, and the world hasn't fallen apart. So yeah, I think
we're anticipating a global downturn in a big way as well. Yeah, it'll be a hard sell.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a hard sell, but I really hope it doesn't derail things, because we need this. We need these conferences to succeed. If you've got any kind of hope for global action on these issues, for sure.
Jeffrey Beyer, Managing Director of Zest Associates, a Dubai-based consultancy. Jeffrey, this was awesome. Thank you so much. Richard, I think we found our sustainability expert for the 966. Well done, Jeffrey.
It was nice to go to school, and understand it a little bit better and see where we are. I'm not sure there's something more definitive. We're at a definitive place, but I understand it better. And obviously it's critical to our future.
Very good. Thank you, Lucien. Thank you, Richard.